June 24th, 1967. The Mossdale Caverns, northern England. 10 cavers set out to explore the caves, confident that they could find new passages even though they knew fully well that it would be a challenging adventure. The caves were notorious for never having been mapped out properly on account of their difficult nature. There was never enough space to stand. Many parts of the caves could only be reached after long, grueling crawls through mud and tight, wet spaces. More people have reached the top of Mount Everest than those that have seen the inner recesses of the Mossdale Caverns. They were hoping to make history, and they did, in the worst way possible. Only 4 would make it out alive. This is the tragedy of the most claustrophobic disaster in cave diving history. The expedition was led by 2 men, 26-year-old David Adamson and 24-year-old Jeffrey Warren Boireau, experienced cavers who felt confident in their abilities to lead the group through the difficult caverns. There was nothing tourist-friendly about the journey ahead of them. The Mossdale Caverns were essentially a death trap in the making. Discovered in May 1941 by Bob Leakey, a member of the British Speleological Association, when he was looking for a fallen tobacco pipe, the Mossdale Caverns have been something of a geological hellscape, so much so that it's classified as super severe. Located on the southern slopes of Great Whernside, a fell in the Yorkshire Dales, the caverns sit about 4 kilometers northeast of Coniston, a small English village, and contain over 6 miles of underground tunnels and passages. The entrance of the caverns sit at Coniston Moor, and high up on the slopes of the moor lies Mossdale Scar, a crumbling limestone cliff. This may seem unimportant, but it is on the moor that Mossdale Beck, a stream, flows down into the cavern. The cavern actually consists of 2 caves, and the main reason why it's so feared is because the network is highly prone to flooding. As most of the passages can only be passed by crawling, while others take wading through neck-deep water to get through, and with names like Marathon, Knee-Wrecker, and Umaguli, it's no wonder potholers usually avoid the Mossdale Caverns. When the caves fill with water, they're impossible to get through, and it only takes 1 freak rainfall on a good day to turn an exploration into a tomb. A return trip to the far end takes between 8 and 10 hours, and, to this day, the section that links both caves is yet to be discovered due to the sheer perplexity of the caverns. But David and Geoffrey believed their group could brave it. After all, although most of the caves were unmapped, Leakey had managed to reach the end of it, and so had 2 other men, Mike Boone and Pete Livesey, in 1964. Plus, the 2 had explored the cave before, and they knew what lay ahead of them. The group of 10 explorers, a mix-match group from 3 different caving clubs, left Coniston Village and entered the cave system at around 2 p.m. that Saturday. They were aware of the weather forecast beforehand. They knew there were thunderstorms slated for late in the afternoon, but they were up north and the storms were expected in the south of the country. To top it all off, it had been a particularly dry week, and the moor tops, where the entrances to the system are located, were dried out. In fact, the entire June had been mostly rainless. There was little risk of flooding, so the group believed they were good to go. Part of the group was 22-year-old Morag Forbes, Dave's fiancée. The pair were to get married in just a month, and their exploration of the Mossdale Caverns was just one of many adventures they hoped to take together. Dave and Jeff, who had only recently gotten married, were both from Leeds University. The rest of the group consisted of Bolton-based Happy Wanderers Club members, Jim Cunningham, John Shepard, and John Ogden, all 21-year-olds. From the Bradford Pothole Club, there was 23-year-old Colin Vickers and 19-year-old Bill Frakes, both experienced cavers, in addition to the youngest of the group, 17-year-old Michael Ryan, a beginner. Tagging along with them was 19-year-old Colette Lord, who was looking for a fun afternoon out and decided to accompany the Bolton Cavers. The plan was to use explosives to open up a blocked passage named Mini Cow Passage, while the others would help carry gear. But some members of the group, despite the forecast, weren't too sure about the weather. There were also the 2 women in the group, Colette and Morag, who weren't cave explorers, itching to go back. Their afternoon underground was all well and good, but they could sense that, from there on out, it was only going to get more dangerous and wanted to turn back. Jim and John had also decided to back out on account of the weather being unclear. Dave was okay with the 2 women backing out, but he believed the guys were just using the ladies as an excuse to chicken out of a grand adventure. He reassured them that all was fine, and that he knew how to get through the caverns safely, but the 2 men insisted on escorting the women back. So, after a few hours underground, at around 5 p.m., Colette, Morag, Jim, and John emerged from the entrance of the cave. The first thing they noticed was how gray the skies were. a sharp contrast from the sunny, clear skies that sat overhead when they entered the caves earlier. Then the worst happened. It began to rain. While the four had turned back, Dave, Jeff, and the rest of the group had pressed forward in their exploration. They had gotten past drown or glory swims and had also made it through rough and knee-wrecker passages. The next area they had to brave was their hardest one yet, near marathon. There are 2 marathon crawls in the cave system, near marathon and far marathon. Both are about 900 f long and have only about 12 inches of space, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. The sections can only be passed by crawling sideways on the stomach in a shallow stream. There was no room to turn back. In between the 2 sections is a 5-foot area that's large enough for cavers to stand before they push on in the far marathon. The group of 6 had managed to complete the near marathon and were ready to continue. They had no idea that, outside, above the underground caverns that would soon become their grave, the skies had opened up and the rain would only get heavier and heavier. In fact, they were about to start celebrating a small victory. The group had made it to the last section of the far marathon, and although there was still a narrow passage and tight squeeze to get through, they were sure they could make it. After that section, they would be ready to clear out the rest of the cave for mapping. Everything was going great, or so they thought. Above ground, while Jim and John drove Colette back to nearby Ingleton, Morag huddled up in a barn, watching the weather take a turn for the worst, knowing fully well that, if it didn't stop soon, her fiancé and everyone with him would be in serious trouble. The group wasn't due any time before midnight, but things were looking bad. In only 3 hours, 1 inch of rain had already fallen. By the time Morag returned to the cave entrance at 9 p.m., none of the potholers were out. And, to confirm her worst fears, Mossdale Beck was quickly rising, and the entrance of the cave was covered in water.
Yeah, I'm about 10 minutes from Neereka. On my way down near Marathon.
Morag turned around and ran 2 miles in the downpour to Yarnbury Farm, where she sought the help of a farmer, Mr. Riley, who phoned the police. Down below, the group had already noticed the rising water levels. At first, it didn't seem like it would impede on their progress, but the more they waited, the higher the water rose. At this point, they would have probably concluded their work for the day, but turning back wasn't an option. They were 3 hours away from the entrance. It would have been impossible to make those marathon crawls again with the water pouring into the cave. However, the more they waited, the more water came their way. Their only option was to get to higher ground, and, in their case, higher ground would mean the passage between far and near marathon. They began the grueling crawl in the opposite direction, pushing through the rising stream beneath them. Michael and Jeff were the first 2 to get back into the chamber, and it was no easy feat. That section of the cave required them to push forward with their arms alone to get through the tight squeeze. Worst part is, the water at this section of the cave would have been coming directly at their faces, and it was rising, rapidly. As they struggled through the wet, muddy passage, the water only rose higher and higher. Their wiggling forward was only a desperate attempt to escape the inevitable. It would have been impossible to claw their way through the rock and mud, and with the thin space they were stuck in, they were only pressed down in place as the water rose, and rose, until they were totally submerged. David Adamson had led the group to their graves. At 11:10 p.m., a full cave rescue effort was on. There was still hope that the group had found a chamber above the water to huddle in. Perhaps they had found air pockets that could sustain them until they were rescued. Volunteers dammed off the entrance and installed 19 fire pumps to get the water out of the caves. By late Sunday morning, the rescuers had managed to significantly reduce the water levels in the caves, and, led by experienced caver Jim Eyre, some went in. As more water was pumped out of the cave, one more rescuer, Tony Waltham, followed. By afternoon, the group had reached the far marathon. The area was dry now, but it was silent. It didn't matter how often the rescuers yelled into the dim. There was no response. Waltham discovered the first 2 bodies, those of Jeffrey Boireau and Michael Ryan, jamming the roof of passage. The pair had struggled to the very last moment for the very last breaths of air. Further down the path, 3 more bodies were found, those of David Adamson, Colin Vickers, and Bill Frakes. The only body that had not yet been found was John Ogden's. It wasn't until the following day that his body was discovered. In a struggle to stay alive in the midst of the rising water levels, he had forced himself into a tight crevice that his contorted body was difficult to locate. In the darkness of the caves, squeezed between layers of tight rock, the 6 men had been left with the time between when water started filling the cave and the moments they died to think about just how their ends would come. Their professionalism forced them to remain calm as they traversed the passage, even though they knew fully well that the moments they had to hold their breaths in the cavern, it would all be over. The rescuers' hopes were dashed in seconds, and so was that of the men's families. All 6 of them died in the most painful way imaginable. The cave was sealed with concrete afterwards, but in 1971, after consulting their families of the victims, the Mossdale Caverns were reopened. In a letter from Mrs. Adamson, Dave's mother, addressed to the Home Secretary in 1970, she stated, "I have managed to keep a sane view on Mossdale by asking myself what David would wish me to do about his interests. Would he have wanted to keep others out? Would he want to deter others from gaining the knowledge that he sought? I know he would say carry on, and the lessons learnt, apply them." The bodies were moved to mud caverns, a chamber at the far end of the system, where they were buried, and to this day, a plaque with the names of the sick men sits at the entrance of Mossdale in memory of them.